Good dang, we're starting. All right. So we're going to continue with the immune system. I know it was ages ago. It was 2 weeks ago on March 10th. And I was so disappointed together we missed the Ides of March. We're possibly, but we maybe have maybe a spirit component here today. Uh-huh. I know. Your buddy is in transit. I didn't. Oh, you are? Hi, Kinsey.
Hi.
Welcome to people listening to see the vision who enjoy the organization. Hello. Hope you're having a wonderful travel day. Oh, you did. So that's cool. All right. So let's begin with what we're going to be doing here. And this is really the hard part of the immune system is not here yet. This is, if you will, this is the easier part. And I don't know what you're doing in immunology. So I'm going to try to go over it. I could maybe contradicts is the wrong term. I mean, maybe let me know if this is something that confuses you vis-a-vis if you're taking immunology with Dr. Maurer about some of the things that he's pointed out. Remember, it was all about barriers. If you get through the outer barriers, the ones that are always there, or innate immune system, whether it's the physical end of it, linings and skin, or whether it's the cellular and chemical end of it, so to speak, on the, should that barrier be breached, it's all, the response is, of course, very, very generalized. This is, if it gets through those barriers and still is detected by your adaptive portion of the immune system, now it has to mount a specific defense. That's the same way it doesn't necessarily imply that this is a deadly pathogen, some deadly disease. I mean, it could be a common cold. I mean, cold viruses are everywhere. You get them. If I'll say it again and again, it's a numbers game. If it's a relatively small number, your innate defenses cope with that. They neutralize them. They gobble them up. Maybe they make it into a couple of lymph nodes. Maybe they make it into a little sinus or an adenoid. It doesn't matter. That kind of a thing. Big thing is if those numbers are too large to cope with, sooner or later it's going to pass that barrier and get into a position where it's going to trigger an immunological response. That's when the adaptive immune system gets busy. It's going to, and this is the idea of specificity. Even though it goes all over your body, it is specific to that particular virus or that particular bacteria. Not just generically speaking. If it's a cold virus, it's that particular rhinovirus. If it's a staphylococcal infection, it's that particular strain of staphylococcus. So now we're going to be engaging a very, very specific arm that is tailoring its response to the anatomy of that particular pathogen, to a particular appendage of that pathogen that identifies it. And there's a lot of terms we use for it. We can call it the determinant. We can call it the epitope. And it forms whatever the defense is, whether it's cellular or whether it is effectively a chemical defense in the form of an antibody, specifically to that particular determinant or epitope. Yeah, the terms are often used interchangeably. So, yes, it amplifies the inflammatory response in order to do this. So now you're engaging a whole lot of other systems within the bloodstream and within the tissues to amplify the inflammatory response. Just indicates that this is no longer an insignificant but a significant violation. Activates complement, and complement is an important part of activating a variety of avenues to deal with invaders. Okay, and the difference is time. And this is the whole idea of why, the whole theory behind immunizations. Okay, we're dealing with if the initial exposure, or if it's an exposure where you have, or if it's an exposure to a particular immunogen that has how should I say it? Trying to think of the right way to express it. I just lost my train of thought. Maybe it would be like a tetanus infection. So, and tetanus is not, and the reason we have to get periodic tetanus shots, we lose the immunity over a period of time. The immunological memory is finite. It's not infinite. And it's not, and that's not so necessarily for everything. But let's say for tetanus, we realize that, when you get to 10 years, it's very sketchy. And the problem is we're dealing with why there's a problem is why we utilize immunizations is to avoid either the severity or the potential lethality of a disease, a pathogen, whatever way you want to describe it. And by doing that, effectively, we give them a modified dosage of something that has been somehow altered. And the fancy name we use for altering these things, we call them attenuated. When you attenuate something, attenuated, you alter it in such a way that it retains its ability to provoke your immune system without causing damage. So you're going to have an immunological response, but not to the extent that it's going to damage things as a part of it. So it's going to be reactive, but not to the severity of it. And what it's going to do, more importantly than anything else, it's going to trigger memory cells by whatever arm of the immune system is activated, whether it's the humoral arm, triggering memory cells to make antibodies, or the cellular arm, where it's going to trigger response in the form of cellular-based cells like killer T cells that you can reactivate on relatively short order. That's the whole idea of those things. Priming takes time. So the initial exposure, and very often the response is inordinate. That second response is inordinately huge. That typically works to our advantage. We can upgrade and start producing tons of antibodies rapidly, tons of immunological cells rapidly. That's the good news. There's bad news. When you have an over-the-top response to an allergen, you can generate a life-threatening condition called anaphylactic shock, an inappropriate response of your immune system that's over the top. So there's so much to it. It's the most complicated system I talk about physiologically. And this is an odd term because I know Dr. Maurer is talking about it, and I don't want to, and we don't sit there and compare notes for these types of things. But what's about it, when we get to this system, is specific. The fact that it got this cold virus, it's why we don't have an immunization for the cold, it keeps changing. And since it keeps changing, why bother? There's a couple of hundred different strains of those viruses, so it's particularly specific. That's a little different when we have something like measles, mumps, and rubella, which are relatively constant. Not all viruses, not all bacteria are created equal in that regard. Some are much more prone to mutations. This could beg the discussion I don't necessarily want to get into with all classes, because you'll get my spin on it. It's the over-the-top response we had for something called COVID-19. Everybody lost their mind. Why they lost their mind, I don't know, but it did exactly what a lot of experts predicted it would do. After an initial, every succeeding mutation of this virus, which by definition mutates almost at will, every succeeding mutation makes it sometimes more contagious, sometimes less contagious, but inevitably makes it less and less problematic. So it makes its way to all of a sudden going from, oh my God, to, yeah, it's a pretty bad cold. Don't get me started on it, because I have to phrase everything as a bit. Yeah, we know, you and I both know, it's about the zonias. It's about remember, when all else fails in medicine and pharmacy, remember these three words: always about life. And maybe not during my lifetime, but during yours, we'll find out. WTF went off. And you're the victims. You gotta sit there and go to school, wear those stupid masks. Have to get shots. Spare me. Don't get me started. So if you're wondering, my wife and I never had any quote unquote immunization, if that's what you want to phrase it. So moving on. So what happens, your immune system is specific. It recognizes and targets specific antigens. It is systemic. It goes all over the place. And and the whole idea is immunological memory. And don't misunderstand me, as my mom used to say. I am not anti-vax. I'm anti-safe vax. I'm anti-unsafe vax. But I'm not anti-vaccination. I'm perfectly happy that my two little bandits this weekend are fully vaccinated. I'm happy. Okay? I want them to be healthy. Okay? It has memory and mounts an even stronger attack to known antigens, second and subsequent exposures. Again, not forever. We know there's a limit. And so these are the two. The one we're focusing on first is the humoral branch. Read that as antibodies. And then the one that is, I think, more complicated and a bit more difficult to understand is the cellular or cell-mediated immunity, which we will get to. Two asides. From the responses I've gotten, I'm thinking we're going to do the exam on Friday, as opposed to Wednesday. Friday.
Like this Friday?
Not next Friday. This Friday. You good with that?
I may or may not be here.
We can only hope.
We don't know we're playing IUD yet.
So it could be here and it might not
I
be.
could be, I could not be. We're supposed to find out more information by tomorrow.
We can deal with that. We optimistic. Are you going to be away for a lot of days?
No, just
Darn.
3 days. We got back from Green Bay at 7 a.m.
How was Green Bay? Was it cold?
It was horrible. But we won 3 games.
How bad could it be?
It was cold. I had the party gift from Green Bay.
You have a parting gift?
Yeah. They gave me a gift when we left.
They'll give you a cold.
Oh, yeah. I was taking to it.
Right? And my son has to fly to Green Bay because one of the programs he has to be in charge of is the frigate program, which is about an hour away along that Bay area.
There's nothing there. A lot of it.
Okay. So, and you're not moving to Wisconsin anytime soon?
No,
It's
no.
a beautiful state. Not there, I know. It's cold. So, antibodies, made by lymphocytes, particularly B cells, as they change, go through all the body fluids, and what they do is they inactivate. They don't destroy those cells. They don't destroy viruses. The whole idea is these are things that are either free-floating in tissue fluid or plasma, or in the bloodstream in any way, shape, or form, or they're sitting on top of cells. What makes them susceptible to humoral immunity is they have not entered cells and altered them. We'll see that. And really, that's the most important thing I can share with you. Not everything is subject to antibodies. So when we get into cellular immunity, you're looking at cells that have been invaded by bacteria and viruses, not a bacteria or a virus or a parasite of some type sitting on top of them. So, I mean, there's a difference between colonizing a layer of cells versus being actually inside and altering the cell. That's what changes it to cellular immunity. Cellular damage that have altered its markings, and the same thing would happen if it's a cancer cell, transplanted cell, a transfused cell. So what happens, these bind to the target, and cell is the wrong description. Okay? They talk to whatever the target is, wherever that epitope or determinate marker is, and they may inactivate it, they may slow it down, they may precipitate it, they may neutralize it in some way, shape, or form. And by doing that, it makes it effectively it slows it down, deactivates it, and marks it for destruction by macrophages. And the macrophages work with complement, they work with a variety of other factors. And so the targets, by definition, are outside the cell. Again, to emphasize the point, on the cell is still outside the cell. There's a lot of bacteria and viruses that utilize the cell or layers of cells as platforms to do their damage. Lymphocytes act against target cellular immunity. The lymphocytes act against the target cell, killing the infected cell. So, and typically it's indirect. They release chemicals, enhancing inflammatory responses, activating other white blood cells, activating macrophages. The targets are cells that have specific markers that have been altered. We'll go into all that. In the old days, and I gave you this when we did the blood, the term antigen is used differently. Antigen used to mean antibody generating. That's how it got its name. That's how I was taught it 50 years ago. More. Now we know that there are self and non-self antigens. So antigens are just really confined to markers, typically proteins with short chains of carbohydrates that are markers. I'm sure you learned about that in cell. Most are large complex molecules not normally found in the body, non-self. And they can be complete, okay, or incomplete. And the name we give to incomplete ones are haptens. A hapten is half an antigen. That's how it gets its name. And so, and this is real, typically allergens, bless you, are part of it. Allergens bond with existing receptors and complex with those proteins, and so completing them, and then we get allergic responses that are that. And the other thing that happens, so whether it's complete or not, we'll get to that. They have antigenic determinants. Again, the other term I've seen frequently in other authors is epitope. Okay, and yes, we have self-antigens that are there. So in complete antigens, what do they have? They're able to stimulate proliferation of specific either T cell lines or B cell lines, immunogenicity, and they'll react with activated lymphocytes and antibodies that are released by immunogenic reactions. So they're going to have, and this is a formal language, they generate an immune response, they react. So, and all of these things, if indeed they are not something that we are used to in our body, whether they're certainly by definition foreign proteins, foreign polysaccharides, different lipids and nucleic acids, and a lot of them are in a lot of different invaders that are there. Not just microorganisms, pollens, chemical agents, things like that. The hapten are so called because they are not visible to the immune system, to maybe limited peptides or nucleotides, small chemicals, and again, when you see a permissive term, the idea is it doesn't always do this, become immunogenic if it attaches to the body's own proteins. Then it's seen as foreign. So you may wonder, and you may know people who all of a sudden have should I say it? You're getting a, trying to think of the right way to explain it. They're not allergic to something, and all of a sudden the allergy develops later in life. So it's not, I mean, the fact, and I will tell you with patients who's never allergic to penicillin, and all of a sudden they are. It can be any time, the next dose.
Is that like the Lone Star tick something? Have you heard of that?
Say again?
Have you heard of there's a tick called the Lone Star tick?
Okay.
If it bites you, then something about
You may introduce a chemical or something like that.
It causes you to become allergic to like red meats. So you can
Oh, don't keep it away from me.
It's like, I think it's somewhere in South America. It's more common down there, but it's like
So much steak, so little time. Man cannot live by chicken alone or fish.
still shellfish.
Hey, Favorite things, crustaceans, arthropods. Or as we like to say in our house, shrimps. So we have a kick-ass recipe for mango shrimp, coconut, Thai style. Oh, just a little bit to kick it up a little bit. Moving on. So the whole idea is maybe maybe the way I would express it is the unpredictability of the immune system might be part of it. So, and again, the immune system will mount an attack that is harmful to the person because it can attack cell proteins as well as the hapten. That's one problem. So a lot of times these will create immunological episodes. They may be a source of autoimmune phenomena. I mean, I was saying it to my other, because we're doing immune system in A&P with the other two classes I have preceding you. I said, your immune system, when your immune system is working perfectly, you never notice it. That's the goal of the exercise. You don't want to know it's there. When you know it's there, there's a problem. And the problem you want the least of is to have your immune system attacking itself. Because what it does is an autoimmune attack, or rather attacking you as opposed to say attacking itself, is it's widespread, as you can see from this discussion, and it's horrible. That's rheumatoid arthritis. That's systemic lupus erythematosus. That's type 1 diabetes. That all of these are known autoimmune phenomena. I mean, these are the complications of strep throat, scarlet fever, rheumatic heart disease. I mean, you can just keep going and going and going. It is extraordinarily problematic. And so there are other things as well. So these are things that kind of work this way. Okay, poison ivy, like animal dander, like being allergic to cats or dogs, detergents, cosmetics, they're a little bit different. Poison ivy actually has more of a cellular-based immune response, as do some cosmetics. It's interesting. It's more of like we call it like contact dermatitis. It's what we call delayed reaction hypersensitivity. We get into this at the end of this unit, in the last portion of looking at immune system. So there's some interesting nuances with this. It takes a while. Why the delay is, let's say with poison ivy, is a resin. Poison ivy, that resin will absorb through your skin over time and eventually trigger the immunological response. And the same thing is true for certain cosmetics. I'm fortunate not to have problems with animal dander or detergents. I may be unfortunate with regard to a certain cat in our house. Very annoying. But we would have, look, if I was allergic to cats, I'd have to leave. The cat's going to get to stay. Cats rule. CIC, we call them, cat in charge. That's what I'm saying. So to continue the idea with all of this, I've seen it so many times. That's why with poison ivy, what do they tell you to do? If you feel you're out in the woods, you've been camping for a few days, the first thing they tell you to do when you get back, shower. If you haven't had the luxury of having to have a shower, depending on the campground or you're out more in the wild, the sooner you get those, whether they're animal dander, resins, any of that material off, the less likely you are to have a response. It's absolutely true. And it does interesting things. With poison ivy, I get what's called a fixed drug eruption, which means I have a very predictable response. It doesn't matter what I get it on, I break out on my neck. Go figure. I mean, it responds to topical cortisone agents. And I've been using it as an excuse for like 50 years not to go camping. Unfortunately, I believe I'm going to be stuck this summer. I had to promise her we'll go camping. My idea of roughing it, going to a hotel that doesn't have room service or a hot tub in the room. Just me. She wants to go. Ugh. So the determinants, the parts that bind with the specific receptors. So the parts of the antigen that either bond to the antibody or bond to the activated lymphocytes. A lot of determinants. Different populations are mobilized. We have to look at the different antibodies specifically. This is the whole theory, not theory, this is the practice of why we use chemically simple molecules as implanted materials. For years, we've used stainless steel, polyethylenes, different materials that are either lookalikes for biologicals, but then, and as long as they remain intact, there's a whole science behind metallurgy. We're using the right kind of, we used originally stainless steel, we used titanium, we use steel with various kinds of coatings that are on them, all of those things. I go off at all the time. When we go through the TSA at the airport, because I have a couple of stainless steel sutures. That's what we use them. They're low reactivity. You can sew things up that have a likelihood of being infected, potentially being infected because they react. They don't react. We use monofilament nylon for the same reason. My go-tos were monofilament nylon. And when I had to use deep suture, assuming there was not a problem associated with it, I'd use what's called polyglycolic acid, which is a chemical that the body has an enzyme that dissolves called bicol. Those are my go-tos. Maybe the science has changed dramatically. Voila! Here you can see different antibodies. Here you can see something that has a different antigen. They're showing the determinants or the epitope by means of shape, whether it's pointed, rounded, or has sort of like a knob, a la one of these markers. And you can see the antibodies are formed directly to it. So all of our cells are covered by self-antigens. Okay, proteins on the surface that are not antigenic to self, but others transfusion to grafts. That's the whole thing, and we'll look at it again just with that ABO system because we may be blood typing today. The whole basis of it. The shape of these small short chain, short chain polysaccharides that are basically glucose and fructose projecting from protein markers on our red blood cells. That's all they are. So are they self or are they non-self? Do we have them or are they not? Okay. One set of important cell proteins are groups of glycoproteins called, again, glycoprotein, sugar protein, called MHC, major histocompatibility complex. They're very unique. And as you can see, T lymphocytes can recognize only antigens that are presented on specific MHC proteins. We look at them all the time. Those MHC proteins are the things that you're trying to, when we're doing it, trying to think of the right way to express it. When let's say there's a community drive to find someone with a compatible kidney, okay, they're going to test for these self-antigens. Maybe they'll do a blood test that will try to match up 80 of those, okay? And let's say if somebody is 60 or more, that's sufficiently compatible and they probably wouldn't have offered to take the test unless they were going to be willing to donate a kidney. Okay? That's how you're able to determine whether someone is a suitable donor. So even if it's a relative, I didn't do it. Once I see people track you. I'm going to ignore it. Is anybody evacuating or is he? Dr. Dress isn't here, so his group over there. Darn. Okay, moving on. So, two types, B cells, humoral, T cells, cellular, and you're going to go into these. We've talked about them a little bit in previous classes. We have what are called antigen-presenting cells. They are in a lot of areas. Sometimes they're just sampling the environment. They're in the liver. They're called Kupfer cells, Kupfer. They're in the skin, Langerhans cells. They're in different areas in the gut. And what they effectively are doing they are latching on, they're sampling areas of the environment. And if they grab something, they basically present it to one of these, a B cell or a T cell, and say, hey, is this, should this be here or not? And so they're tremendously essential, and we'll get more into that when we look at the activation of particularly T cell activation. So T and B lymphocytes, again, they start origin in the bone marrow, doesn't matter. Okay. The difference is their origin in those lymphocytes is in the bone marrow. Their maturation, and we don't use the term maturation so much as we say they become competent. And then once they are, when they're competent, it means they have the capacity to be activated by a foreign marker and either be a B cell line or a T cell line. That's the difference. And so where they quote unquote mature and gain competency, when they're born, the term we use is naive. So that's important, even from a test perspective, from going forward, from an MCAT test perspective. If they have the term competent or activated, they don't mean the same. It's really important. So you have that, and then and you can see whether they're produced from lymph nodes. And here they're giving you an example of something that came in. The T cells and the B cells effectively populated a lymph node. They came in contact with an antigen. That antigen, foreign antigen, began to develop not only B cells, but change those B cells into giant chemical factories that make unbelievably large amount of antibodies very quickly. So the lymphs are educated, a 2 to 3 day process. Primary lymphoid organs, B for bone marrow, T for thymus, where they get their names. And they have immunocompetence that may be able to recognize only the one antigen. Okay. They only display one type of receptor, so when they're mature, only can have one type of antigen, and they must be unresponsive to their own antigens or to our own antigens. That's part of this process we call maturation. It's there. And then once they have matured and now they've gained this degree of competency, okay, so immunocompetent B and T cells are yet exposed to antigen are called naive. So I misspoke. The naive comes when they have yet to be exposed, okay, but they're now gained a degree of competency. So I had it bass backwards. So, and they go where they have to go, mostly the lymph nodes, spleen, pick a place. So that's important to remember. I always get those confused between competent and naive. It's okay. And then once they encounter, that naive lymphocyte encounters the antigen, it triggers it, and at that point, depending on what the trigger was, whether it is triggered something that's going to the cell-based line or the humoral antibody-based line, it will start to clone itself, okay, and it will activate in that regard. And again, they're showing you this same illustration. So at that point, this army, and so we don't use the term mitosis, even though it is. We talk about cloning. Most of the clones become effector cells. Effector cells are the ones that are going to either produce the antibodies, and then the antibodies will circulate all over, or they will be ones that will produce the appropriate cells. And there's always going to be memory cells. That's the beauty of the memory cells. B and T memory cells and effector T cells tend to circulate for long periods of time. Not indefinitely, again. For instance, there's a lot of things that if you see recommendations for boosters at certain parts of time, a lot of times it's because of that, ignoring the ones that have anything to do with COVID. So it's all about the antigens, and that means it's all about genetics. So I was saying, we are pre-programmed. A lot of us are programmed by what we are genetically from our ancestors, from what we've acquired from areas where we live or reside traditionally. So 25,000 different genes code for up to 1 billion different types of lymphocyte antigen receptors. Okay, and so there's a lot to it. There's a lot of diversity in this. We're not certainly not all the same. T cells, and they go in, and I don't care about this. Negative and positive selection. I'll just verbalize it for you. Positive means T cells capable of recognizing self, and those that can't are destroyed. So you have to be positive, recognize itself, and if not, they're destroyed. And cells that bind to self are also destroyed. Okay, they delete the clone. So you have what are called positive and negative. I won't ask you about it. To me, it's more word salad, gobbledygook. If they don't know what to attach to, they're not helping the system. And they're just showing you how these ideas of binding with that graphic. The antigen presenting cells, the dendritic cells that we see in a lot of different areas. I was telling you about in the skin, dendritic cells, plus you in the liver, other areas. Variety of macrophages play a similar role. And as we're going to see when we get into the adaptive immunity, the B cells play a line as well, both triggering antibodies and also playing a role potentially triggering T cells. So B cells can also act in a similar fashion. So mobile sentries, because the dendritic cells move around. They're not fixed in locations. And these are the environmental samplers. The interlymphatics present antigens to T cells. Okay, they're the best ones, and they're really the pivotal link. And then that goes back to the whole idea, since you didn't have me for micro, this what they call the hygiene hypothesis. Why? It was the crown heads of Europe. They were so, the whole idea was an heir and a spare. Henry VIII killing all those wives, okay, because he wanted both a male heir and a male heir spare. If you're not producing, you've got a problem here. And the one gal who did, unfortunately, died of childbirth fever, but we digress. But that little boy who didn't reach his majority, he became king in name, but there was a regent. His uncle was the one who was basically running the kingdom, as it were. Because every day they wouldn't let him play with other kids. They'd wash down the walls 3 times a day with lye. They'd have all his foods were very, very limited. Only specific people he came in contact with. I mean, it was just crazy. So the first time he encountered anything of significance, boom, I think he died of pneumonia when he was about 15. And that was something they did. That's the hygiene hypothesis. I mean, I don't know what it's like with your folks. I'm not judgmental. Our folks threw us out of the house after school. Go. You're not going to watch TV. I want you outside. Got home at 3. I don't want to see you before 5 o'clock. But no buts. Come back bleeding. Why don't you come back? I said, not till 5. Typical parent. We didn't have to worry about it being snatched or anything like that. That wasn't types. I don't know that there were less predators, but there was a network in neighborhoods. All the moms looked out for all the kids. You got in trouble at the playground. Your mom knew by the time you got home. Even if it was like 5 doors away. Somebody called somebody who called somebody. You know what Lewis did at the playground? The kids, my whole class, my whole grade knew my mom and dad by name. Because they were in school all the time, because I was always getting called to the principal's office. Oh, hi, I see your mom's here. Oh. And what goes around comes around. How many times I go, okay, what do you do now? Okay, what did my daughter do this time? She dyed the back of her hair pink. Is there a problem with her? You don't approve of the color? Honestly, that's the conversation I had. We think it's distracting to other children. Well, that's because you think. It doesn't mean it is. I had one of those. Well, worse, and they do that effing in loco parentis. Well, we're the parents here. I don't give a flying effing. God, I hate educators. But you can see I'm not opinionated. Okay, so this is really important. That's what it looks like. Dendritic cells are white blood cells, all those tentacle-like projections. They are aggressive. All of those can bond and will grab it in. And what happens is when it presents, basically it's taking in the entire microbe. And when it does, gobbles it up and it presents the epitope. It presents the determinant. So that's the whole idea of an antigen presenting. So it's not presenting the whole virus or the whole bacteria. It's presenting that area. And indeed, the antibody or the T cell will form to that specific marker based on its shape. Again, it's proteins and carbohydrates. It's about shape. I've never met a T cell that could see that. Okay, widely distributed, present antigens to T cells, not only activates them, but what it does, it's like a co-activation. I mean, if your adaptive immune system is being activated, what does that mean? You've had a boundary that's been violated. So now you've got to send signals to everybody else. It's like, what the heck's going on? We've got an invader, and you didn't do anything about it. So get your posterior in gear. Okay, and so that activated macrophage is going to take over inflammatory responses, recruit additional defenses. So it's such a good analogy for how things work, whether it's in the military or in business world. I mean, the way things work. If this happened, something was wrong. B lymphocytes do not activate the naive T cells. They present antigens to helper T cells to assist their own activation. So it's kind of unique in that regard. And then we've talked on, or at least identified now for the record, the single most important cell of your immune system. Its name says it all, the helper T cell. Tragically, it's the one cell that is the line that's compromised and eventually destroyed by HIV. Let me just give you a nice summary of what they do, and you can read that. So what happens when a B cell encounters a target antigen, it provokes the humoral immune response. It's an immune response that is manifested by chemical production, antibodies. That's with the nursing students I had that discussion with them earlier. We started doing immune system. It's very hard. I say, true or false, antibodies are the way that your immune system works, always. And they're like, true. I mean, I understand that this is an important arm, probably the most frequently used arm, but not the only arm. B cells are activated when they bind to surface receptors and cross-linking with them. You're going to see what happens. The trigger receptors mediate endocytosis of these cross-linked complexes and start clonal selection. So you can go through all the language, but just to understand that they're activated by those antigens, then it goes through this cross-linking and eventually generates it. And with the exception of memory cells, they form plasma cells. Look at the numbers. It takes a while to ramp up for speed. We're usually probably looking at maybe 6 to 10 days to get up to speed to make these antibodies. 2,000 molecules per second for 4 to 5 days. It's not like there's 3 of them. There's giant clones of these. That's an immense amount of chemicals being poured out. So if you wonder why maybe you don't feel great when you're trying to fight off a virus or a cold or anything along those lines, or a sore throat or strep throat, this is part. Your immune system is ramping up to speed. It's using a lot of resources for you to be able to do this. The antibodies circulate all over, binding to any of those free antigens and marking them for destruction by the innate or other types of mechanisms that are there. They're just showing it to you, you're almost done. So they recognize the antigen, they're cloned, the vast majority of the effector cells. The effector cells develop a large amount of rough endoplasmic reticulum. That's how you distinguish them from the typical lymphocyte. So they're structurally different because they're making antibodies to proteins, rough endoplasmic reticulum. They're going to secrete, and yes, there's memory cells. And that's the immunologic memory, not an immediate response in the future. And so they're showing this to you, and this is the problem, the lag period. So That first time, 3 to 6 days to start to produce antibodies, 10 days to reach peak. So when you go to, like my kid's been texting me, he's got some kind of a infection. He just had to go to urgent care. He goes, oh, they put me on antibiotics for 10 days, Dad. That's why. Your immune system can take over, but it can take 10 days. So the typical time they're going to give you, even if it's a Z-Pack, that's 5 days of taking it, but the way it's constructed, it's going to be released over time over a 10-day period. That's why it works. We know the number. Sometimes it's less, but many times it's that 10 or longer. And then peak levels of plasma antibody are reached in 10 days. Antibodies levels then decline. Re-exposure, because of the memory, hours, not days, unbelievably higher, greater affinity to bind, stay high for long periods of time. This is the chart. Last slide for today, thankfully. First time you're exposed to it, before you ramp up to start making antibodies, that 7 to 10 day golden zone. Then it declines over about a month. Now, the second stimulus with the memory, boom, hours. Massive amounts, multiple factors of 10 over, going from 10, going here to thousands, very, very quickly. That's the beauty, and that's why the justification for a variety of immunizations. But if it's another antibody comes along, okay, we're going through the same process again. Thank you. Okay, we'll see everybody in one of those labs. I'm going to go